The situation, of course, in the Middle East continues to go on. I think it is interesting to note just a small point in that regard. The events, of course, that began to happen right at the time of the fall festivals, beginning just at the time of the Feast of Trumpets, of course, signaled a shift. They signaled a turn in the events in the Middle East because showing that we are moving into a new phase in terms of what is happening on the world scene. Because now, for the first time, the attention and the focus is specifically on Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. You know, once the genie is out of the bottle, it's pretty hard to stick it back in, and they'll never be able to go back to the kinds of things that were the focus of attention in the Middle East before. We have clearly turned a corner. We are moving into a new phase in terms of events. Now, let me just sort of throw out something, and this is just sort of an observation or a speculation, and you can observe over the next year and see. But we often look for patterns in terms of realizing, as you look through the Scriptures, that God, you often see patterns in terms of numbers and in terms of significant periods of time. It's interesting that it was, of course, in 1989 that the things turned a corner in Europe and the whole post-World War II era. The whole post-World War II order of things collapsed, and the Iron Curtain came down, and the whole shape of Europe was changed. The events that happened in the Middle East began 11 years later. Now, what I'm sort of wondering about, and what I would just call your attention, is watch the next year, because I think we're going to find that this year, that something that began this feast, by the time you get to next feast, we're going to be 12 years from the time things turn the corner in Europe. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what develops in the Middle East over the course of the next year and where we are next year at that particular time. We clearly, events are moving along, and there are things that are happening, and none of us know the exact time schedule, but we certainly can look in the Bible and we see patterns and we see a uniqueness to this time. And we see events that are happening there in the Middle East. And we see events that are happening in other places. And in the context of that, Jesus Christ said in Matthew 24, verse 14, a very familiar scripture, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness, and then shall the end come." It'll be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. And then shall the end come. Christ laid out a job. He laid out a responsibility. And that responsibility carried on from the time that Christ ascended into heaven. Virtually the last instructions He gave His disciples was go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. That's the way it's recorded in Mark's gospel. Now, that's an ongoing situation, and you never come to the completion of that because there's a new creature being born every second. In fact, probably several of them. So you never get to the end of that. But Christ, in the context of a prophecy about the end of the age, in the context of a prophecy about the things that were going to set the stage for His return, talked about this gospel of the kingdom. The same message, the same good news that Jesus Himself brought. This gospel of the kingdom shall go into all the world for a witness to all nations. Then shall the end come. God always delivers a message prior to His intervention. Now, let's step back a little bit. Let's look a little further at that. As you look through the Bible at God's calling of individuals, you can start in Genesis and go all the way through. We have, as we talked about last week, we have a unique identity. Our identity involves who we are as the people of God. God has called people out of every background and circumstance. We not only have an identity, a sense of identity in terms of who we are as the people of God, we also have a purpose in terms of why we are. Do you ever read in Scripture of God calling anyone and not having any particular purpose in mind for that person? Imagine God calling someone and say, well, I don't exactly know what, don't have anything specific for you, or just sort of, thought I'd call. Don't have anything really in mind, but if I think of something, I'll let you know. God inevitably, as you go through the Scriptures, God has a purpose, and there is a unique purpose, and that's one of the things that is crucial to the unity that we talked about last Sabbath, is that we share a common sense of purpose. We share that common sense of purpose. We have been called for a purpose, and that purpose certainly involves doing the work of God, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom to the whole world as a witness to all nations, recognizing that the message of Scripture, the good news of the kingdom, and the warning messages that accompany that. And warning messages inevitably accompanied the message of the good news. When Jesus included in His message there were messages of warning and messages of witness. You just go through the gospel accounts and read what Jesus said. Read Matthew 24 and the parallel accounts. Read other areas. The Apostle Peter, in expressing what he had been commissioned to do, and the other apostles, in Acts chapter 10, Peter, speaking here to the household of Cornelius, talked about, in verse 36, the word which God sent unto the children of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ. He's Lord of all. How this word was published throughout Judea, began from Galilee. And he says in verse 39, we are witnesses of all things which He did, both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem. And so notice what Peter says, verse 42. He commanded us to preach unto the people. He commanded us to preach unto the people. What did He command them to preach? To testify that it is He which was ordained of God to be the judge of the living and the dead. In other words, Peter was preaching the second coming, wasn't he? He said, He commanded us to preach to the people. He commanded us to testify, to bear witness to the fact that He, Jesus Christ, was ordained, selected, chosen of God to be the judge of the living and the dead. There is a time of accountability. There is a message of warning and witness. Ezekiel recorded a message of warning and witness for the house of Israel. And there's a message of warning and witness for all nations. First God is going to deal with and bring and allow judgment to come upon the house of Israel, and then ultimately, in the events of the day of the Lord, He's going to begin to deal with and to judge the Gentile nations as well. There is a message and a warning and a witness that is to go out. There is a work that is to be done, and God has called us to do it. Now let me ask you the question. We look around here, and we realize that we're glad to be here, and we're glad to have the fellowship and to be able to be together and to hear God's Word. But, brethren, those of us here represent people from all over the Metroplex. I mean, we're all the way stretching across from all over Dallas and Fort Worth and in between and up and down and all around. Small little handful of people. And as we look around the world, small little handful of people. Little tiny group, just, an individual and a family here and there. How in the world can we ever expect to accomplish what Jesus Christ said was going to be accomplished? How can you and I do that? John chapter 15. That's what I want to focus on today. John chapter 15, Jesus drew an analogy, a picture with words. He did that very often. Those analogies, those word pictures, enable us to sort of visualize something. It enables us to see connections and relationships. So Jesus Christ drew an analogy in John 15. Verse 1, He said, I am the true vine, my Father's the husbandman. So here is a description. I said, I am like the vine. My Father is the husbandman. He's the one that takes care of the plant. Now, He says, I'm the vine. Now, every branch in me that bears not fruit, He takes away. Every branch that bears fruit, He purges it, that it may bring forth more fruit. So God is interested in fruit. He's interested in fruit being born in your life and in mine. Jesus said so. Now, He goes on in verse 4 and He said, abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself except it abide in the vine, no more can you except you abide in me. I'm the vine, you're the branches. He that abides in me and I in him, the same brings forth much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. Without me you can do nothing. Now, here is one of the most vital keys to understand as we look at our purpose, the very reason for our calling, the purpose for which God has placed us in the body. He's called us to do a work, and yet you and I, by ourselves, can do nothing. On our own strength, on our own power, we cannot bear the fruit. You know, Christ, He says, the branch can't bear fruit except it is part by itself, part of the vine. You know, can you imagine cutting a branch off of a fruit tree or off of a grapevine and sort of tying it to a fence post somewhere, and then coming out every day, look and see how much fruit it was bearing? Well, that's ridiculous, because it wouldn't bear any. All it would do is dry up, and eventually the only thing you could use it for is firewood. Christ said, you've got to abide in me, and I in you. And He says, if we abide in Him and He abides in us, we will bring forth much fruit. Without Him, we will bring forth zero fruit. Now that is a crucial thing to understand, because verse 7, He talks a little more about that. He says, if you abide in me and my words abide in you. Now here, Christ equates His abiding in us with His words abiding in us. You abide in me and my words abide in you. You'll ask what you will and it'll be done unto you. Herein is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit, so shall you be my disciples. Jesus said, you're my disciples, my students, my learners. And the Father is glorified and you're bearing much fruit. So God wants much fruit to be born. God delights in seeing that fruit. But Christ says we have to abide in Him and He abides in us, or His Word abides in us. Now we're going to look at that a little further as we go along, but it's crucial to understand the fact that what will be accomplished is not going to be accomplished by our human strength and ability. Notice over in Romans chapter 8, in verse 8. Romans chapter 8 and verse 8. Paul said, so then they that are in the flesh cannot please God. They that are in the flesh can't please God. They do not have the power, the ability, and they have no way to truly please God of and by themselves. So he tells us here in Romans chapter 8 and verse 8 that just on a human level, we can't please God. We do not have the power or the capability. We do not have the capacity to please God by our own strength and by our own might, but rather He has called us and offers to us the power, the capacity, the ability to do what we have been called to do. Now, we look over here on the one level at our power, and that Christ said of ourselves we can do nothing. Without Him we can do nothing. Yet, notice what God can do. Deuteronomy chapter 31 makes a very important point. Deuteronomy 31, verse 8. Now this is instruction specifically to Joshua, but it applies. Let's notice the principle here. Deuteronomy 31, verse 8. The Lord, the Eternal, He it is that does go before you. He will be with you. He will not fail you, neither forsake you. Fear not, neither be dismayed. He will not fail you, neither forsake you. In other words, God is neither unable nor unwilling. He will not fail you. See, God is not going to fail. He's not unable. It's not that God is going to try, but He just won't be able to quite make it. He will not fail you. God is neither unable, nor will He forsake you. He's not unwilling. He's not just going to sort of turn around and walk off through the universe somewhere, leaving you behind to sort of struggle with your own devices. It's the Eternal, He it is that goes before you. So we have a calling, we have a purpose, we have a job, and yet of ourselves we can do nothing. We lack power. We lack all of the things that are necessary to bear fruit of and by ourselves. And yet Christ said, if you abide in me, you can bear much fruit, and the Father is glorified by you bearing much fruit. You see, we have to recognize on the one hand our lack of capacity, because if we don't realize that, then we will try harder to do it ourselves. And I don't care if you're unable to do something, I don't care how hard you try, you're going to keep falling flat on your face. It's not a matter of what we, by our strength and capacity, can do. It's a matter of what God can do in us and through us to the extent that we yield to Him. You know, we read in the Psalms, speaking of ancient Israel, Israel in the wilderness, and it says they limited the Holy One of Israel. They limited the Holy One of Israel. They limited what God could do in them and through them because of their unbelief, because in their hearts they turned back to Egypt, because of certain things. God will not fail us. He will not. He is not unable to do, nor will He forsake us. He is not unwilling to do. Abraham understood that. That's expressed in Romans chapter 4. Romans chapter 4 and let's pick it up in verse 20, verses 20 and 21. Abraham, we're told in verse 20, staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief. He was not overwhelmed at what God promised. You know, when you look at some of these prophecies and you read through in terms of the impact that is going to happen on this world, and the fact that this nation and this world is going to be shaken by the work of God and by the truth of God, and God says, they shall know that there's been a prophet among them. They will know that. Now, you know, we can look around at our physical resources, at our small numbers and all these things, and we can say, well, I just don't see how that's going to work. Abraham staggered not at the promises of God through unbelief. He was 100 years old, and God said, I'm going to make you father of a multitude. In fact, I want everybody to know you're going to be father of a multitude. I'm changing your name. From now on, we're going to call you father of a multitude. Go out and call all your people together and let them all know you're father of a multitude. Well, Abraham didn't stagger at the promise of God through unbelief and say, you know, I'm 100 years old. That can't happen. No, he was strong in faith, giving glory to God. Notice verse 21. Here's the point. Being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was able to perform. You see, the confidence, brethren, does not rest in what you and I are capable of doing. The confidence doesn't rest. Well, you know, we got this fellow and he can do that. We got this one, he can do this other. And we've got all of these things on a human level. No, of ourselves we can do nothing. But we need to be fully persuaded that what he has promised, he is able also to perform. God is neither unwilling nor unable. That is the key from Deuteronomy 31:8. Abraham understood that God was able to do what He said. Let's notice a little further. Let's look a little more at God's power. What can God do? Well, let's notice John chapter 10. Let's just pick out a few things and see some of the things God can do. John 10, we'll pick it up in verses 28 and 29. Jesus said, I give unto them, speaking of my sheep, I give unto them eternal life, and they will never perish. Neither shall any man pluck them out of my Father's hand, out of my hand. My Father, which has given them to me, is greater than all, and no man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand. My Father is greater than all. There is no one that has the ability to take something away from God. Now, brethren, God will not hold us against our will, but no one is able to take us. Do you realize that you're in God's hand, and as long as you want to be there, there is no power that has the ability to pull you away? Nobody can take you away from God. God has the power, and no one is able. No one has that power to take you away from God. Let's go back to the book of Jude. A little short book back here just before the book of Revelation. We'll notice verse 24. Only one chapter in the book of Jude. Jude, verse 24. Now unto him that is able, that has the power to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before the presence of His glory with exceeding joy. To the only wise God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forever. To Him that is able to keep you from falling. So nobody has the power to pluck you out of God's hand. My Father is greater than all, and no one can pluck you out of His hand. He is able to keep you from falling. Now, not only can no one pluck you out of the Father's hand, nobody can take you away from God. He is able to keep you from falling away yourself. He's able to do that. Now, you have to want Him to do that. You have to desire that, but He's able to keep you from falling. He's able to, no one is able to take you away from Him, and He is able to keep you from falling. Let's go back to Romans chapter 11. Let's notice a little more what God is able to do. Romans chapter 11. Here it talks about another... Paul draws an analogy this time in terms of the olive tree, and he draws comparison. He labels Israel as a domesticated olive tree and compares it to a domestic olive tree, and he compares the Gentiles nations to wild olive trees, and he talks about the fact that God has cut off many of these branches, talking about Israel, that many of them were cut off and branches from the wild olive tree were grafted in. And he says in verse 20 of Romans 11, because of unbelief they were broken off. Be high-minded. Paul's writing here to Gentiles. He says, don't be high-minded. You know, the Israelites that were cut off were broken off because of unbelief. But then he goes on down that to make the point here in verse 23. They also, if they abide not still in unbelief, if they don't remain in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. Talking here as God was able. He was able to call people out of every background, and He was able to graft them in. He was able to make them a part of what He was doing. He was able and is able. It tells us in Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14, here he's talking about those who are weak in the faith, and the specific issue in Rome had to do with meat offered to idols, buying meat in the public meat markets, much of which had come from idol temples early that morning. And so it had become an issue of contention in the church at Rome. And the main thing Paul was dealing with was the attitude that people were having toward one another. And he said in Romans 14:4, "Who are you that judges another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Yes, he shall be held up, for God is able to make him stand." God is able. God has the power, the ability to make him stand. God is able. No man is able to take you away from God. He's greater than all. God is able to keep us from falling. God is able to do what He has said over and over and over. God is the one who is able to do what He says. So He has called us to do something, and He is able to see it successfully completed. You know, some of the Jews of Jesus' day sort of thought that they had God a little bit over a barrel. I mean, God was, they thought they really had the inside track. And notice here what this is talking about John the Baptist and Matthew chapter 3 and verse 7. When he, John the Baptist, saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them, O generation of vipers, who has warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth therefore fruits meet for repentance. And don't think to say within yourselves, well, we have Abraham for our father. Don't think you've got it made because of who you are. Don't think to say within yourselves, we have Abraham for our father. We don't need what you offer. We don't need to bring forth fruits for repentance. Notice what John said, for I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. God is able to do whatever He chooses to do. God's able. So, it's not a matter of our inherent strength or power or capacity. It's not a matter of numbers or money. It is first and foremost a matter of God working in us and through us. God is able to successfully complete what He's done. And God God offers gifts. It's not that you and I, of ourselves, we can do nothing. Christ talked about that, and He says, you have to abide in Me, and I in you, and if you abide in Me, and My words abide in you, you'll bring forth much fruit. The Father's glorified by that. God wants to bear fruit in our lives, and God offers gifts to us. Notice in Romans chapter 12. We're told in verse 1 what our part is. IBC, as you go on through the chapter, you see what God's part is. But notice what our part is. Romans 12:1, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. That's what God has every right and reason to expect of you, that you present your body as a living sacrifice. You yield yourself totally, wholly, unconditionally to Him. Holy and acceptable unto God. You see, we are to yield ourselves. Don't be conformed to this world, but be you transformed by the renewing of your mind. Don't fit in with the world, blend in, and be part and parcel of this society. Be transformed in your mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, a new heart, a new way of thinking, that you may be able to prove what's that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Because if we are truly being transformed by an inner renewal of the Holy Spirit, we will be able to prove, we'll be able to put to the test and prove out what is God's will. Then he says, I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Don't have some great inflated opinion of yourself, but think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith. Whereas we have many members in one body, and all the members have not the same office, so we, being many, are one body in Christ, and every one members one of another. We have a connection one of another. We are members one of another. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given unto us. So God gives gifts, and all of us have gifts from God. And Paul discusses a few of them here. We'll see that he discusses others elsewhere. In 1 Corinthians 12, he discusses others. And there are other mentions and places through the Scripture that mention certain gifts that come from God. We have gifts different. And it's according to the grace, according to that which is freely given and bestowed. In some cases, prophecy. Prophecy here in the context means an inspired utterance. Someone who speaks by, let's say, divine revelation. That's a gift. You go through the Scripture and God granted specific, let's say, specific things to certain individuals, revealed revealed in many cases the future, certainly as we normally think of prophecy. Much of the inspired utterance was an outline of the events that lay ahead. You know, God has declared the end from the beginning, and He will do nothing except He first reveal it through His servants, the prophets. So, inspired utterance is a gift that God has given. Verse 7, or ministry. Serving, that's what it means. Let us wait on our ministry. Or he that teaches on teaching. He that exhorts on exhortation. He that gives, let him do it with simplicity. He that rules, someone that organizes and administers with diligence. He that shows mercy with cheerfulness. He just mentions here a variety of different things. They're different gifts. Some have a real gift for serving. They just have a knack to see what needs to be done, get in and do it. Others have a gift for teaching. Just a gift of being able to take something complex and make it simple and plain. Be able to explain it. There are others that have a gift for exhortation, a gift to exhort. Exhortation differs from teaching in the sense that teaching involves explaining and making something clear. Exhortation involves motivating people, stirring someone up. There are some who have a gift for exhortation, for being able to stir up and to exhort and to motivate others. Those that have a gift for giving. God has, there are those who have a gift for ruling and administering, organizing. Some people just have a knack. If you want something done, they can organize it. They just have a knack to be able to put it together and make it work. They have a gift for doing that. There are those who have a particular gift for showing mercy. They have an empathy. They are able to pick up on things with other people and just have an ability to connect with others and to be able to help or to encourage, to just have a special gift for demonstrating kindness. There are a variety of gifts that are mentioned. But that's what they are. They are gifts. A gift has behind it a giver. God is the giver. Now, there are inherent natural gifts, and then there are spiritual gifts. There are inherent natural gifts. It's interesting in Matthew 25. Notice the way it states it here. This is one of the parables Christ gave, a parable of the talents. Matthew 25:14. It says, the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country who calls his own servants, delivers unto them his goods. So here's the comparison that he's drawing. And unto one of the servants he gave 5 talents. Talent was a measure of Roman money. And One of them he gave 5 talents, and to another 2 talents, and to another 1. To every man according to his several ability. And straightway took his journey. Now, here he showed a gift being given, something that the king gave his servants. And they were to produce and to use that gift in a certain way, use what was entrusted to them. And we're told that he gave it to them in accordance with their ability. He decided which gifts to give. So spiritual gifts will often have a connection in terms of the natural abilities that are, let's say, the natural gifts that we have. But ultimately, all gifts come from the giver, from God. If you notice over in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul talks about, now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I would not have you to be ignorant. So he says, I want you to understand and to know about spiritual gifts. Now he says, you know you were Gentiles, carried away unto these dumb idols, even as you were led. He said, you didn't know the truth. You were involved with worshiping idols. You were a part of that system. And so many of these people in Corinth had a misunderstanding about spiritual gifts. You know, brethren, our understanding is colored by our background, by the experiences that have shaped us, that have molded our thinking and just the things that we grew up around. The people in Corinth grew up a few miles away from one of the most famous pagan oracles of the ancient world, the oracle at Delphi, the oracle of Apollo. Now, they had certain ideas. You know, they were attracted to things that were sort of showy and flashy, and a lot of times the certain of the terms were similar, used to refer to things that the pagan oracles claimed. Paul says, now, you have been in a situation where you have been shaped by idolatry, and there are a lot of things you don't understand. He says, I want you to understand one thing to start with. No man speaking by the Spirit of God calls Jesus accursed. You know, as you read on through, you read that there was an issue involving speaking in tongues or languages, and that was something that many of these were really, they wanted. And Paul said, you know, there's one thing to begin with, is if God is inspiring it, the message that comes out is going to be the truth. Now he said, look, verse 4, there are diversities of gifts. There are differences of gifts, but it's the same Spirit. There are differences of administrations. There are different ways to organize things and administer certain things, but the same Lord, the same boss. There are differences of operations, but it's the same God which works in all. So the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man to profit withal. God gives His gifts through the Spirit of God to enable us to successfully carry out what He has called us to do. It is for a profitable, beneficial purpose. To one is given by the Spirit the word of wisdom. To another the word of knowledge by the same Spirit. Now there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. Wisdom has to do with, let's say, being able to apply certain principles in life and being able to see how things will fit together. And you can read in Proverbs as it discusses the difference between knowledge and understanding and wisdom. There's certain shades of difference between each of these. Knowledge, of course, has to do more with a command of information and facts. He talks about faith. He talks about gifts of healings. He talks about other types of miracles. He talks about prophecy. He talks about discerning of spirits. He talks about miraculous gift of languages. You see, all these works, verse 11, all these work that one and the self-same Spirit, dividing to every man severally as it will. So the Spirit of God makes manifest different gifts. The body is one, has many members. And so Paul then goes on to show in verse 18, God now has sent the members, every one of them in the body, as it pleases Him. God has called a variety of people from a variety of circumstances and backgrounds. The issue is not what you and I can do of and by ourselves. The answer is nothing of permanent, long-lasting consequence. What can God do through us? Well, incredible things, to the extent that we do not limit the Holy One of Israel, to the extent that we understand that God is neither unwilling nor unable. You know, God has called down through time. You ever think about the extent to which God has called such a wide variety of personalities? God gives a wide variety of gifts. God's called a lot of different kinds of people. You know, back in the book of Numbers, you read about Moses. And we're told there in Numbers that the man Moses was the meekest man in all the earth. Now that's quite a remarkable statement. Since that's what God says, then we know that that's an accurate statement. Moses was a meek individual. You know, when you go through and you read the gospel accounts, now Moses was the friend of God. He was a very meek individual. You go through and you read the New Testament, and there were a couple of Christ's disciples that he gave a nickname to. They were brothers. And he named them the Sons of Thunder. Nobody ever called either one of the Sons of Thunder the meekest man in all the earth and the second meekest man in all the earth. Oh no, you know, you remember James and John. Christ nicknamed them the Sons of Thunder because they were always charging off and ready to do something drastic. You remember the story? They were coming down, they'd been in Galilee and they were coming to Jerusalem and they took the direct route. Most of the time the Jews would go way out of their way to bypass around Samaria. But if you look at a Bible, if you look at a map, the most direct route is to come right down through Samaria. A lot of antagonism between the Jews and the Samaritans. They were coming down through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem, and they stopped at a village to get something to eat, and nobody would sell them anything. Because they could see that they were Jews headed to Jerusalem. And they didn't like Jews, and they didn't like people going to Jerusalem, so they wouldn't sell them anything. You remember James and John, they said, Lord, you want us to just call fire down from heaven? Why don't we just burn the place up? Not a particularly meek thought. Let's just nuke them. Just leave sort of a black crater here. Christ says, you don't know what spirit you're of. You know, right there nearby, you read, John came up and he said, Lord, he said, we saw somebody casting out demons in your name. I told them to stop. Christ said, what did you do that for? John, just naturally, of and by himself, wasn't a meek bone in his body. He just ready to charge on in. In fact, you find out how unmeek James and John were, and the rest of the disciples weren't just light years ahead of them either, because you remember the disciples heard James and John talking to Jesus, and then they found out what they had said. Because what James and John had said is, Lord, we'd like to sit on your right hand and on your left. They even got their mother into the act. She evidently wasn't particularly meek either. She got into the act. And when the other disciples heard it, they were mad. Well, they thought, these guys are trying to jump to the front of the line. They think they're going to elbow their way in and they're going to get to be in charge. Yet you look at James and John and what God's Spirit did through them. And see, here's the thing we need to understand. Sometimes we get exasperated with one another. Sometimes we can't figure out why God called so-and-so. You don't have to figure it out. God didn't ask your advice, and He didn't ask my advice. He didn't ask our opinion. You think I can use old so-and-so? Well, no, I don't think you can use him. Okay, I won't call him. God didn't need our input when He decided who to call, did He? And He called people of a wide variety of temperaments. And sometimes our problem in interacting is it's like, what's wrong with you? Why can't you be more like me? Now, we don't say it in quite those words, but that's really the bottom line. That's why we have trouble understanding sometimes someone, because they may be quite a bit different than us. You go through and you read the story, and you read the ways that God worked with different people. Different people had different lessons to learn. James and John had certain lessons to learn, and you find that they were used in a very powerful way. Very powerful way. They were part of the inner circle of Christ's disciples. You can look at differences of personality. Let's go back to the book of Nehemiah. Let me show you something here. In the very beginning chapter here in Nehemiah, and we'll pick it up in chapter 2. Nehemiah had heard news of what was going on back in the area of Jerusalem. This is after the Babylonian captivity, and several decades earlier, a group had gone back under Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple, and they had, but the city had never itself been rebuilt. Nehemiah gets word of this. He is a cupbearer to the king of Persia, and he secures the appointment of governor. Now, Nehemiah came to Jerusalem, and one of the things you begin to learn about Nehemiah as you read chapter 2, Nehemiah was a thoughtful person. He was not the kind of guy who just impulsively came charging in and announced everything. Nehemiah sort of kept quiet, thought about things, analyzed things, thought it through, had a plan. Sort of a meticulous type individual. He came to Jerusalem, we're told in Nehemiah 2:11, and I came to Jerusalem and I was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, I and some few men with me. And I didn't tell any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. So he came there, he was very quiet about what his plans were, what his purpose was, didn't say a whole lot. Didn't tell anybody what was really on his mind and what his whole objective was. Verse 13, I went out by night by the gate of the valley, and he went through and he viewed the wall at dark, at night. He didn't really want to be observed, didn't want everybody to know exactly what all he was doing. Nehemiah was getting the facts. He was a careful individual. He was organized. He went out, he got the facts, he sort of quietly checked into everything, did not make a big splash when he arrived. He went out by night, viewed the walls, and verse 15, turned back, entered by the gate of the valley, and so returned. And the rulers knew not where I went or what I did. Neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor the priests, nor the nobles, the rulers, or any of the rest that did the work. First, he very carefully gathered the facts, evaluated things, looked at it, decided, and then, as you see, he called everybody together, told them, here's the plan, motivated them, stirred them up, and then he proceeded to organize. And if you go through chapter 3, you find out he had different ones he stationed at different points all along the wall. He had a very thoroughly organized approach. Nehemiah was not an impulsive, sort of a shoot-from-the-hip type guy. He was careful, he was thoughtful, he tried to get all the facts, to analyze, to put it together. Now, you look in the New Testament, Christ used Peter in a remarkable way, used him as the leader of the 12. I don't think anybody ever accused Peter of being a fellow that kept quiet and very carefully gathered all the facts and really thought about it and analyzed it before he rendered an opinion. No, what you find as you go through the New Testament is anytime anything came up, Peter was the first one out of the box. He always had something to say. In fact, one of the, I think, funny comments that's given, 3 of the gospel accounts give you the account of the transfiguration on the mount. And one of the accounts mentions that when Peter and James and John were up there with Jesus and they saw Jesus in glory and Moses and Elijah appear with him, Peter piped up and said, Lord, why don't we just build 3 tabernacles? One for you and one for Elijah and one for Moses. And what I think is funny is the parenthetical statement that one of the gospel accounts adds in. He said this because he didn't know what to say. There's some people, silence bothers them. I mean, some people, if they don't have anything to say, they just sit there and you don't hear a peep. They don't say anything. They don't know what to say, so they just keep quiet. That was never Peter's problem. If he didn't know what to say, he'd just say something. And sometimes it didn't particularly fit. You know, Peter was an impulsive sort. And he was an individual who was quickly stirred up, very impulsive, ready to jump into things. Now, you know, Christ calls people out of God hasn't used a cookie cutter, you know, to just stamp out everybody just alike. We're not all a bunch of yellow pencils. You look through the Scriptures and you find varying differences. Now, you know what? We may have a variety of personalities and temperamental types, but God is ultimately interested in the same character. See, the same law applies to everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're very thoughtful and analytical or you're real impulsive. The Ten Commandments, all 10 of them, you know, they apply both. God desires the same spiritual fruit in your life: love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, meekness, temperance, faith. God desires all of those. Now, I'll tell you what, some of those may come a little more easily in some of us and others with greater difficulty. But God has called people out of a variety of circumstances. It's not just one type of person. Nehemiah had certain strengths in terms of organizing things. He was a very good administrator. It's incredible as you read the book of Nehemiah and you find out the amount of time it took him to get the wall finished. I'll tell you what, if he went in the building contracting business, he could make a fortune. I mean, he could punch those things out just like that. As you go through here, the statement, it took him 52 days, as it mentions in Nehemiah 6:15. They'd been working on it for years. Nehemiah came in, carefully gathered all the facts, analyzed it, thought about it, got it all lined up, had it organized out, called people together, and got things moving. He had a knack. He had a gift for that. And God used him. But God used other people in a very powerful way who were not that way at all. In fact, you know, David is going to be king over all of Israel in the world tomorrow. David had certainly he had remarkable abilities. But you know, you read at least at one phase of his life, one of the things got a lot of people frustrated, and his son Absalom used it as an excuse to stir up people and get people sort of frustrated and agitated at David. As you read the account, you find that there were people standing in line, waiting in to get to see the king, to have their case heard. And Absalom went around, and he was a real politician. You know, if he were around today, he'd be running for something. He would come up to people and introduce himself and say, what are you here for? And they would tell him, and he'd say, you know, you really have a good case. Oh, that the king would deputize. Oh, that I were a judge in Israel. Boy, I sure wish I could help you. And then he went on, he says, you know, oh, that the king would set somebody to hear these cases. You know, oh, I wish the king were better organized. I tried to get him to let me help him. Oh, that I were a judge in Israel. You really have a good case. Well, I don't know about you, but if I had been standing in line all day, waiting to get in, and maybe had to come back the next day, I'd probably get a little frustrated. It doesn't take, most of us don't just love to stand around standing in lines. So, Absalom had a situation where he could work on people's frustrations. Now, you look at it and say, well, could David have been better organized? Maybe would Nehemiah have maybe done it a little differently? Or maybe Moses, who at least at the behest, at the urging of his father-in-law, got things organized out pretty thoroughly. The point is, God was looking for the heart of a shepherd, and that's what he saw in David. There are so many other there's so many other examples in terms of different things that you see with people. You know, if there was when Christ saw Nathanael, he said, "Behold, an Israelite in whom is no guile." That was one of the ones that he chose as one of the 12. And when when Christ was first introduced to him, that was his observation. That was what he saw. Behold, an Israelite in whom is no guile. This is given in John chapter 1. And John 1:47. Nathanael, we're not told a whole lot about Nathanael in the Bible, but one of the things we learn is he was a person who was just very, very open. There wasn't a deceitful bone in Nathanael's body. He was just, Christ pointed him out and said, this man is a remarkable person. He just has no guile. He's not out trying to sort of maneuver and manipulate. He is just open. Now, God called a man by the name of Jacob who certainly did not. Nobody ever said of Jacob, boy, Jacob sure has no guile. No, Jacob was he had too much guile. And he had to go through a lot of lessons to learn how to get rid of some of it. But you see, God called people who were very much different and will obviously have major roles. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are called collectively the fathers, and are will undoubtedly have a very high role in God's kingdom. Nathanael is going to sit on one of the 12 thrones, judging one of the tribes of Israel. Here are individuals who quite a bit different in terms of personality, in terms of natural tendencies. One of the interesting characters of the Bible to me, and certainly an individual that you talk about a trusting soul. I think one of the most trusting souls in the Bible has to be old King Jehoshaphat. Sometimes we don't read and think about some of these analyses that are given about the character of different ones, but a fair amount is given us in Scripture. About 3 chapters in 2 Chronicles. Beginning in chapter 17 on through chapter 20. About 17, 18, 19, and 20. 4 chapters are devoted to Jehoshaphat, primarily in 2 Chronicles. He's also, of course, mentioned in Kings as well. But some interesting things that you read about him as you find, and I think one of the things here that's given in 2 Chronicles chapter 18 is sort of a remarkable story. It gives you a little bit of insight into the man. Jehoshaphat, as I say, he was a trusting soul. He was a fellow who always tended to see the best in people, even when there wasn't much to see. And Ahab, who was the king of Israel and was as wicked a king as Israel had, Ahab in 2 Chronicles 18:3 asked Jehoshaphat to come up and help him to recapture an area that had been taken away from him. And Jehoshaphat agreed. He said, I'll be glad to help you out. Jehoshaphat was the sort of fellow, if you were broken down by the side of the road, you would want him to come by because he would be glad to stop and help. And Jehoshaphat told Ahab, he'd be glad to help him. And they went up there and they had a meeting, and Ahab had all these pagan priests out there dancing around, and Jehoshaphat was uncomfortable, and he said, well, I would like to talk to a priest of God, or a prophet of God. And Ahab didn't really want to do that because the only one around, Ahab didn't really like the prophets of God. Micaiah was God's prophet, and Ahab didn't want to call him. He says, I don't like him because he never has anything good to say. Because, see, what Ahab was generally up to wasn't something very good, and Micaiah didn't approve of it. And Jehoshaphat said, oh, no, please don't talk like that. Please, let's call him. So Micaiah came, and Micaiah gave God's revelation, and he said, look, I'll tell you exactly what I saw. I saw all Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Go on out to Ramoth Gilead, Ahab. Go out there. You're going to get killed. God has it all planned out. Well, Ahab looked over at Jehoshaphat and he said, see, didn't I tell you? He never has anything good to say. Well, notice here, though, in talking of Jehoshaphat and a little bit about his character and nature, in chapter 18, 2 Chronicles 18:29, the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, I'm going to disguise myself and go to the battle, but you go ahead and put on your robes. So the king of Israel disguised himself and they went to battle. Now the king of Syria had commanded the captains of the chariots, and he said, look, I'm not interested in anybody but Ahab. I want you to get him. You fight, I'm not interested in who else you kill, but I want Ahab dead before this battle is over. So sure enough, came to pass, guess what? The captains of the chariots saw Jehoshaphat, and they said, it's the king of Israel. Why? Because he was the only guy out there with royal robes and a crown on. And so they compassed him about to fight, and Jehoshaphat cried out, and the Lord helped him. And you find that a stray arrow struck Ahab, and sure enough, he was killed. Now, ask about this. I mean, you go through, and you know a little bit about Ahab. Here's the prophet, and they say, you're going to get killed today. And Ahab comes to you, and he says, I tell you what, why don't you put on the robes, but I'm just going to wear some old grubby stuff, and we'll both go out there. What do you think Ahab was up to? Well, Ahab, nobody ever accused Ahab of being a real trusting soul. Ahab thought he was smart enough to outmaneuver God. He said, king going to be killed today, huh? Well, it's not going to be me. Nobody's even going to know I'm the king. I'm just going to put on some stuff. I'll be out there where I can sort of see and direct things, but nobody will recognize me. If they're out gunning for a king, they're going to get old Jehoshaphat. That was what he thought. He just really set Jehoshaphat up. And Jehoshaphat fell for it. In fact, as you go through the account, you find Jehoshaphat fell for thing after thing. And yet he was a man who was very sincere. He really sought to, as you go through in the aftermath of this account in chapter 19, how the prophet came to Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 19:2 and said, should you go out to help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? You're going to get in trouble for this. Notice what Jehoshaphat did in the aftermath. How did he react? Well, he was a humble man, as well as being maybe a little naive and gullible. He went out again through the people from Beersheba to Mount Ephraim. He brought them back to the Lord God of their fathers. He set judges in the land. He told the judges, you take heed what you do. You don't judge for man, but for the Lord. He is with you in your judgment. Let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Take heed what you do. And he set Levites and the priests for judgment. And he charged them. You're to do this in the fear of the Lord faithfully with a perfect heart. And he organized things. He was, many different things that, a little later he was overwhelmed by this big invasion, and he really went to God and besought God, and God blessed him, and God intervened and fought his battle for him. Jehoshaphat was a very sincere man and served God in a very devoted way, and yet he was not he was the kind of person who was fairly easily taken in by others. He could always sort of see the good in folks, even when there wasn't much. Notice here, as we come on down here in the latter part of chapter 20, we're told that in verse 35, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, joined himself with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who did very wickedly. Ahaziah was a successor to Ahab. He joined himself with Ahaziah, who did very wickedly. Joined himself with him to make ships to go to Tarshish. They made the ships in Ezion-Geber. Now, Ezion-Geber was the port that Judah had, right down at the very top of the the Red Sea. And they needed, the king of Israel wanted to use Judah's port, and so they made a deal and got Jehoshaphat to go in partnership with him, and God sent a storm and destroyed the ships. But Jehoshaphat got himself tangled up. He was always falling for some idea somebody had come up with. He'd want to help him out. Now, on the other hand, you'd have to say Jehoshaphat, he was a pretty positive person. He had a lot of ability. He organized things well, but he was taken in by people. He was always one who was just sort of quick to believe the best and found it hard to assume the worst on anyone. Now, you go back and you look at the 12, and we're given a little insight into different ones. Think about Thomas. He goes down in history as doubting Thomas. Well, there's a reason for that. Because he was one who was Thomas could look on the gloomy side of things. If there was a gloomy side to be found, Thomas could probably find it. And one of the accounts you have back here in the Gospel of John, where in John chapter 11 and John 10, Jesus had been in Jerusalem at the Feast of Dedication, that is the Hanukkah celebration in the winter. And a little later, as you put the story together, perhaps 6 weeks, 2 months later, he got word that Lazarus was very sick. And he waited a little while and then said, let's go on up to Bethany where Lazarus is. Now, in John 11 verse 6, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. Then after that, he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. And the disciples said, well, Lord, you sure you want to go to Judea? Last time you were up there at the Feast of Dedication, they threw rocks at you, tried to kill you. You want to go back up there? And so Jesus said, yes, I'm going. And so he said in verse 15, let's go unto him. We're going to go. Notice what Thomas said, verse 16. This is one where Thomas sort of piped up. Thomas said to his fellow disciples, well, let's go also. We might as well die with him. You could just sort of see the expression on Thomas's face as he heard talking about going back to Judea. Why would we want to go back to Judea? They were throwing rocks at us the last time we were up there. Christ said, no, we need to go to Judea. Thomas looked around at the others and we might as well go up there and die with him. Thomas was a fellow who could sort of see the gloomy side of things. He was not the eternal optimist. In fact, Thomas was a person who was just not quick to take other people's word for things. Very different than Jehoshaphat, who was willing to believe the best even when there wasn't much good. The account that you're given on down here a little later in the gospel accounts after the resurrection, on back in John chapter 20, Jesus had appeared after the resurrection. In John 20 verse 19, the disciples were gathered in the upper room. They were assembled for fear of the Jews. They had the door locked. And Jesus just appeared right there in their midst. And he said, peace be unto you. And the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. And so, coming on down a little later, we find in verse 24 that Thomas wasn't with them when Jesus came. Thomas had not been there that evening. The other disciples, when they saw him, said, we've seen the Lord. It's true. What the women told us is really true. We've seen the Lord. And Thomas said, I don't believe you. Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I won't believe. I don't believe that. That's impossible. I saw his dead body. He's dead, fellas. I don't know what you saw, but I don't believe it. Well, a little over a week later, the disciples were together and Thomas was with them. And Jesus came, the door was shut, and he just stood right there in the midst. And he said, peace be unto you. And he looked over at Thomas and he said, come here. I want you to reach out your finger. Reach out your hand and thrust it into my side. Don't be faithless, but believe. Thomas said unto him, My Lord and my God. Now Thomas did believe. Thomas was a fellow who was a little bit harder to convince than the average. You know, it's interesting because as you read a little earlier in the account in John 20, you read that Mary Magdalene had come early and she had seen the empty tomb, and she ran and came to Simon Peter and to John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and she told them, John 20 verse 2, they've taken the Lord out of the sepulchre and we don't know where they've laid him. Peter went forth and the other disciple, and they came to the sepulchre, and they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter. He got there first, and stooping down, looked in, and he saw the linen clothes lying there. But he didn't go in. He just looked. And Peter came following. You know, he was sort of chugging up from the rear, and he was huffing and puffing, and he got there a little later, but he didn't stop. He just went bowling right on into the sepulchre. A little bit of the difference here between Peter and John. John got there first, but he stopped, and he was a little bit more cautious, and Peter just came roaring right on in. And they saw where the clothes lay and the napkin that was wrapped around his head. And then John also went in after Peter did. And notice what it says here in verse 8. Then went in also that other disciple which first came to the sepulchre, and he saw and believed. It hit him what had happened. He believed. You know, when he saw it. Now, it was a difference because the others, evidently, Christ appeared to them literally. And then in Thomas's case, Thomas wouldn't believe what the others told him. You know, such a wide variety of individuals. Let's notice one here in back in Luke chapter 10. An account that we're told in Luke 10:38 that they went and came to a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. This is Martha, who had a sister called Mary. And Mary sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. Verse 40, Martha was cumbered about with much serving. And she came to him and said, Lord, don't you care? My sister's sitting over here and she's left me to do all this by myself. Tell her to come help. Now, Martha was evidently a leader. She's the one that took the lead. She evidently is the one that invited Jesus. And she was busy and she wanted everything just so. She was cumbered with much serving. And she really got exasperated at her sister who was sitting over there listening. And, you know, Mary and Martha were very different personalities. They were sisters. And Jesus said unto her, Martha, Martha, you're careful and troubled about many things. You really worry about things, don't you, Martha? You want everything lined up and everything perfect. And you're careful and you're troubled. But you know what's most important? That's what Mary has chosen. She's sitting over there listening to me. That part's not going to be taken away from her. You know, we're going to sit and we're going to have a meal, and a little while later we're going to be hungry again. You're just going to have a bunch of empty, dirty dishes, and you'll have to clean up, and we'll be gone. But you know what Mary is getting right now? That's permanent. Now, it's interesting because we're told in John 11, which is the account of Lazarus, who was the brother of Mary and Martha. And Mary is the one that anointed Jesus' feet with ointment, as we're told in John 11, verse 2. And notice verse 5. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Jesus loved the whole family. Mary and Martha were very different personalities. Jesus didn't love one and not love the other. He loved Martha. And as you go on through the story here, when Jesus came down to Bethany, John 11:20, Martha, as soon as she heard Jesus was coming, went and met him. Martha still sat in the house. She was just sort of overcome with all her grief for her brother. Martha took the initiative. Martha had a lot of leadership. Jesus loved Martha. The point is, God has called people out of a wide variety of circumstances and situations. look at the different styles of the books in the Bible. You know, God used the different styles of different biblical books reflect the different gifts and the different personalities on the part of the authors. Now, you look through there and you look at you go through and you read the Psalms, you read the passion that is poured out. You go through and you read certain more didactic teaching sections, reflect a different personality. God put together a complete book from Genesis to Revelation. You see, the point is, the work of God is just that. It is the work of God. The work of God is not dependent on us. We are rather dependent upon God to successfully accomplish the very purpose for which we were called. God has called us for a distinct purpose. He has called a wide variety of individuals. He's called people of different personalities and out of different situations and circumstances and backgrounds. But the issue is not the fact that we all have a collection of different strengths and weaknesses. The success is going to be based on the extent to which each of us, with whatever strength or weakness we have, to the extent that each of us yield ourselves as instruments in God's hands. You know, Daniel said in Daniel 11, verse 32, "The people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits." You see, God is neither unwilling nor unable. The work of God will be successfully completed by those who do know their God, who are walking with God, who have a deep, personal, abiding relationship with God, who abide in Christ and His words abide in them. Regardless of their personality. You know, Jesus Christ and John the Baptist were very different. In fact, Christ told the Pharisees, He said, John came as a very austere individual. He came living a very abstemious lifestyle. He was, and you criticized him. You said, well, that guy must be demon possessed. You know, he lives out there in the desert and he lives on this austere diet, and he's very, certain way, certain personality. Christ said, now I came quite a bit different, eating and drinking and just, being there and with a lot of people. And you point at me and you said, well, this fella, he's a drunkard, a wine bibber, friend of publicans and sinners. You criticize me and you criticize John. He said, wisdom is justified of her children. God has used different people of different personalities, different temperaments. The point is, those who won't listen. I don't care who it comes from. God has used a variety of different individuals and personalities because He has chosen to work through people. But you see, those who know their God, and that's whether it's Moses or Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, whether it's Daniel or David, whether it is King Jehoshaphat, or whether it's Nathaniel or Thomas or Peter or James or John or whomever it is. One thing that all of them had in common was they knew their God. They knew God. Brethren, as we find ourselves right now in what is in reality a lull before the storm. I can't stand here and tell you how long the lull is going to last. But I'm going to tell you this, when it's over, it's over. We have been called for a purpose. And the only way that we will successfully accomplish that purpose is to yield ourselves, to yield our bodies as instruments of righteousness, to yield ourselves to God, to walk with Him, to abide in Him, and let Him abide in us through His Spirit and His Word. And as we do that, those who know their God will have spiritual strength. They will have the strength and the spiritual wherewithal to do and to finish the work that God has set before us.